Welcome, everybody. On behalf of the Moore Institute, I'd like to thank you for joining us this evening for our session on Galway and the creative arts, performance and representation. John Cunningham and the School of History and Philosophy here at NUI Galway, and indeed the Moore Institute, is the driving force behind this event. We're broadcasting on Facebook and Flirt FM, as well as via Zoom. John is the editor of Hardiman and After, the Arts and Culture in Galway, edited along with Ciaran McDonough. This is part of a series that he's put together. We already had a first session and very much looking forward to this evening's discussion. So John, over to you.
Okay. Right. Thank you, Dan. And thanks to the Moore Institute for hosting this, which is the second webinar in our Hardiman 200 Years On series. Thanks also to our four panelists, who I'll introduce in a moment. So these sessions, as Dan said, were planned as seminars in the university until circumstances forced us online. And I'm grateful to the panelists for making the switch with such alacrity. I want to welcome our live audience, or rather audiences, on Zoom, on Facebook, and also on Flirt FM. More people anyway than we could have packed into a seminar. Now, the Hardiman project marks the bicentenary of the publication of James Hardiman's classic history of Galway. One element of the project is a book looking at cultural endeavour in Galway and its vicinity for the past 200 years. It's called Hardiman and Beyond, Galway Arts and Culture, 1820 to 2020. I'm one of its editors. The other is Ciaran McDonough, who featured in the previous webinar. 36 writers in total have contributed to the book, including all of our panelists here this evening. Publication of the book was delayed, but it will be appearing from Arden later in the year. Now, I should point out that there's a facility on Zoom for asking questions or for commenting. Either type them in using the chat function or raise a virtual hand. That's on the right hand of your screen. I'll take questions mostly in the second half of the proceedings. And do take note that the proceedings will be going up for posterity on the Moore Institute's YouTube channel. The discussion tonight will range widely in time before settling for a while in the 1970s or thereabouts. We're trying to do two things in the next hour: to discuss the way in which Galway has been represented by artists and writers, and then to examine some of the creativity in music, in theatre, and in literature in the past generation or two. As with the previous webinar, we find we have multi-talented panelists, and two of them at least will be contributing musically this evening. Maybe we'll be able to release Hardiman's greatest hits alongside the book. Now, I'm going straight now to introduce the panel. And Hodge, who joins us from Dublin, is the Curator of Prints and Drawings at the National Gallery of Ireland. Gerard Hanberry is a poet, a biographer, a busy musician, and also a tutor in creative writing at NUI Galway. Professor Lionel Pilkington is a leading authority on Irish theatre, and he works in the School of English and Creative Arts here at NUI Galway. Anna Falkenau is an ethnomusicologist. She's also a musician, and she's currently completing a PhD on the Galway traditional music scene in the Centre for Irish Studies. So straight on to our first question, which I'll put to Hodge. And since we're, we're here because of James Hardiman, our activity was prompted by his book, I'll start the ball rolling with the question about the visual images in Hardiman's history of Galway of 1820. Can you tell us a little bit about them?
Yes, imagery and illustrations were very important in Hardiman's book. In fact, the title page boldly announces the full title of the book, which is The History of the Town and County of Galway from the Earliest Period to the present time, embellished with several engravings. And in fact, there are 14 little images. There are 11 full plate images, engravings, and 3 very small vignettes. But they were very important for Hardiman because they were a means of selling the book, making it more interesting for people who were buying it. And he says in the preface, and I quote, "No pains have been spared that they should be properly executed," that is the vignettes, "and that the drawings should be correct. The distant prospect of Galway and the views of the church, the county courthouse, bridge and prison were taken by an ingenious artist, brought from Dublin solely for the purpose." So we get an indication here that Hardiman didn't feel there were artists of worthy enough to make the illustrations for his book, and he had to travel to Dublin. Now, he obviously went up to Dublin quite a lot and had connections with people like George Petrie, who was one of the leading lights in the art world. And it's likely that the artist who actually did the engravings, Patrick Duggan, the ingenious artist he mentions, it might have been Petrie who suggested that he should do the work. And certainly he seems to have come to Galway and made these drawings. So most of them show notable buildings in the city. The first vignette, or I should say plate, is actually a fold-out panorama of the city taken from the west. So, I mean, I suppose he's stating really at the very beginning of the book the importance of these illustrations. And Duggan had won prizes for in the Drawing Society schools. So he would have been, you know, I suppose Hardiman would have thought this is a young artist who's of note, and we can use him. And he used also engravers who were based in Dublin also. So everything was done to make sure that the illustrations were high quality.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Anne. Now, the first time I met you, I think, some years back, was when I took a group of my MA history students to the National Gallery, and you introduced us to a substantial collection of watercolour images of Galway from the 1830s. These were by William Evans. Can you do a few things here? Tell us about Evans, how he represented Galway, and maybe whether the way he represented Galway was typical of the way artists in the 19th century represented Galway.
Yeah, well, these drawings really are quite amazing. They came into the collection of the National Gallery in 2008. There are 41 drawings in total, watercolours and drawings, by this man, William Evans, who happened to be the drawing master of Eton College, the elite public school for boys in the south of England. And it was his custom to make a sketching tour every summer. And normally he would go to Scotland, or he might go to the Lake District, a beauty spot. He would make lots of sketches, bring them back, and then over the winter he would make exhibition quality watercolours for sale, and he would show them at the big exhibitions in London. In fact, in 1835, it's known that he came to Ireland for the first time, and he went to the west of Ireland, which is quite unusual. And that trip was so successful, and the works he made from it sold so well. He came back in 1838. And you asked, are these drawings of Galway, or are they sort of typical of the time? Are they usual? And I have to say they're absolutely unique, because there are really no images of the west of Ireland or Galway in existence pre-famine. So they're very, very unusual. They're very brightly coloured images, full of colour, full of light, full of energy. For instance, for Galway itself, the city, which obviously connects up with Hardiman's history, for example, and I'm looking at a reproduction here, he has a very beautiful image of Buttermilk Lane. And this shows the city on the 17th of August, 1838. It's dated down the bottom right. And he shows Buttermilk Lane as you've never seen it before, sun-drenched. It looks like it could be a Spanish city. And on the sunny side of the street, the women are gathered. They're selling their wares. It looks like vegetables and different things. They're wearing the traditional shawl, they're barefoot, and there's other aspects that really give a sense of Galway at this time in the earlier to mid 19th century. There's bird cages visible hanging outside the houses, which of course is a very typical Galway thing. And in the distance, you can see the great spire of St. Nicholas, and washing hanging outside the windows as well. So it gives a real sense of a very bustling, busy place. The people are poor, certainly, but the weather was good on that particular day. And we're very lucky that these works exist. And certainly for historians and social historians in particular, they're of incredible value, I think.
Yeah. Yes, thank you, Anne. And if people are interested in looking at the images, I think the National Gallery has placed them online, or some of them online.
Yes.
So search for Evans of Eton, isn't that right? Yeah.
Exactly, that's correct, yeah.
Yeah. So if I can move from visual representations to representations in the written word, using the written word, and move also on a bit in time, I'd like to move to Jerry about the way that writers represented Galway, Galway native writers, as well as outsiders, say in the 20th century. Jerry.
Yes, John. Yeah, Galway as well, I suppose storytellers and poets and writers, they're often very good at capturing the essence of a place. So I took a look at the sort of Galway that emerges through the pages of literature. So what have you got? You've got a lot of water, weather, swans, rain. Galway comes across as a place apart, otherworldly sometimes, distant both geographically and atmospherically. Often you have the illusion of the exotic, but that's on the one hand. But on the other hand, there's the realism, the fact that Galway is a market town. You have great descriptions of cattle being sold around Ayr Square, pigs as well. So commerce is important. It's always has been a city where commerce has been important, hard economics. On the one hand, we have this illusion of the exotic. On the other hand, you have the hard economics of the city. It's a city where class and class differences are important, and they are well represented. So Galway comes across through these pages as a city of contradictions, a city of contradictions. And that idea of the exotic, or the illusion of the exotic, is an illusion, and it's often shattered. Let's take, for example, Eilish Dillon's The Bitter Glass, written in the 1950s, published 58, but set in Galway 1922, yes, during the Civil War. She says Galway was like a different world, and her characters are fleeing Dublin at the time, and they arrive in Ayr Square, and they thought they were leaving their troubles behind. Now, we get that a fair bit, but then reality catches up with them. So the idea of Galway being a place apart, of course, it's beyond the Shannon, as it were, but on the edge of the world. Eilish Dillon, of course, was drawing on her own childhood memories and the smells of the cattle market in Ayr Square. And she describes the train of donkeys, donkey carts and shawls and bawnings and flat black Spanish hats. So that idea of Galway being a place apart. Sir William Wilde, of course, writing back in the 1860s in his famous Loch Corrib, its shores and islands, also got this idea of the magical place to the west, expressed in his typical purple prose. Let us rise with the sun and be off to the land of the west, he says enthusiastically, opening with the great phrase, westward ho. So this fanciful depiction of reflects his fantastical beliefs, of course, in the west as being the land of the Firbolgs and the Tuatha Dé Danann and the Milesians. So again, contributing to the idea of Galway being a place apart, a different world. but yet the reality is always there. He emerges from the train through the great limestone hotel, and as he says, among the beggars into Eyre Square. But then he describes again the commerce of the place: hotels, banks, clubhouses, private residences, coach offices. Not that much different from today. And then Walter Mackin, of course, in that possibly his best short story, The Quál Doll. People will be familiar with that story. A working class lad and his doomed relationship. He meets and falls in love with a girl from a wealthy background, and of course the relationship is doomed. Walter again emphasizing the fact that Galway, for all its illusions of the exotic, is really a place where class is important. And just before I finish up, I'll give a quick one-liner of some interesting observations I came across. For example, Brendan Behan said Galway is a hard place to explain. Yes. And Sean O'Phelan says Galway is and lives a folk tale. Is and lives a folk tale. Very interesting idea. Galway being a folk tale. Of course, I'll talk about the more contemporary writers later on, but writers such as Alan McMonigal, Mike McCormick, Julian Goff, Ken Broon, they've all got this idea of Galway living and being a folk tale. Benedict Kiley says Galway is a city or a town most possessed by water, and of course we're all familiar with Mary Davenport O'Neill's a town troubled by the sea, since it was erected during Courch there in the plaque down by the bridge there at the Spanish Parade.
Thanks, Murray.
Yeah.
Thanks. It's interesting that the plot of the Quál Doll is similar to the plot of Normal People. Is that right?
Very, very, yes.
Indeed.
That whole idea of class,
Yes.
comes through. Now, of course, on the other hand, Galway comes across even in the pre-60s as a place to have some fun and frolics,
Yes.
and which is a major element of contemporary literature, but it was even so back in those days. For example, we see it in song and poetry. Yeats wrote about the Galway races, of course, and as did Dick Byrne in his novel The Galway Races too, but which I'll talk about later if I get a chance, and all the other songs. So the idea of coming to Galway to have a bit of fun and frolics, that song The Galway Races was written in 1869, I believe.
Yes. So are you going to play us that song, Jerry, are you?
Maybe now would now be a good time to do.
Now would be a very good time, Jerry, I think. Yes. Okay.
Okay, we'll try this.
Yeah.
This is the Galway Races. Just getting my orchestra wound up here.
Yeah.
My guitar. Okay.
Right. Away you go, Jerry.
Yes. I went down to Galway town to seek some recreation. On the 17th of August, me mind been elevated. There were multitudes assembled with their tickets at the station. Me eyes began to dazzle, and I off to see the races with your whack, fall the diddery, idle day. There were passengers from Limerick and passengers from Neenah, the boys from Connemara and the Clare and married maidens, and people from Cork City who were loyal, true and faithful, brought home the penal prisoners, dining for nations with your whack, fall the diddery, idle day. It's there you'll see the pipers and the fiddlers competing, the sporting wheel of fortune and 4 3/4, and people without scruple passing wattles at poor Maggie, and her father quite contented, staring at his daughter with her work, But you are falling down for the dairy It's there you'll see the jockeys, and they mounted out so stately, the pink, the blue, the orange, the green, the colours of our nation. The time it comes for starting, all the horses seemed impatient. Their feet could hardly touch the ground, the speed was so amazing. With your whack, fall the dairy There was 500,000 people there of all denominations, the Catholics, the Protestants, the Jews, the Presbyterians, and yet no animosity, no matter what persuasion, but false hospitality, including fresh acquaintance with your whack, Balladale, Balladary Island. With your whack, Balladale, Balladary Island. With your whack, Yeah, 1869.
Thank you, Jerry.
Okay.
I can hear all the virtual applause from the audience around the world. So we can move from the 19th and early 20th centuries now, and also move to talk about cultural endeavour, about creativity in Galway. So I'll move first to our expert on theatre, Lionel Pilkington. Lionel, Druid has become a sort of a touchstone when people talk about theatre in Galway. But what was going on in theatre in Galway pre-Druid in the 60s and early 70s?
Yeah, that's a very important question. So Druid, Druid was started in 1975, and my essay starts in 1958. So between that time, there was about 17 years. First thing to say is it's a really vibrant theatrical scene. I couldn't identify all the theatre companies, but counting them, I identified 11, and they were a mixture of mainly amateur theatres, and some professional theatres. And I'll just read out the list. There was the UCG players, there was Ashtori na Hodge, there was Uncommon Dromiachte, there was the Galway Globe Theatre, the Dominican and Ignatian players, known as the D&I players, a very, very popular theatre group. There was McFadden's Travelling Theatre. They used to set up in a tent in the Fairgreen. It was known as Man's Field in the late 50s, early 60s. There was the Galway Little Theatre Company. There was, of course, on Tyvioch, there was the Galway Repertory Company, the Celtic Arts Theatre. That was Bailey's initiative. It only lasted a few days, really, about a week. And then there was the West Coast Theatre Company. And I suppose the most extraordinary thing is that in Galway at the time, you had one huge 600-seater theatre, that was the Town Hall Theatre. It was utterly dilapidated. And in the period that we're talking about, the period 58 to 75, it was essentially not used. I mean, one time it was used by Bailey to initiate the Celtic Arts Theatre, and it was a disaster because it was a cavernous space, and it was, as I say, dilapidated. So it took a lot to get a kind of excitement going in that. Other than that, the real hub of theatre activity in Galway in this period was on Tyvioch. On Tyvioch, all the plays were done naturally in Irish, but they could also be done in other languages as well, provided those languages didn't include English. So without other dedicated theatre spaces, theatre companies relied on renting parish halls. And there's a whole network of these, the Dominican Hall, Jesuit Hall, Columban Hall, Grammar School Hall, St. Mary's College Hall. These were rented for short periods of time. It depended on the goodwill, which was always forthcoming, of the usually church groups that organized them. And it demanded a lot of sort of improvisation. And also there was a huge amount of touring that went on. Dickie Byrne, who I interviewed a range of people for this essay. And the more people I interviewed, the more things I discovered that I needed to then go on and discover. So the essay took a very long time to write. But Dickie Byrne said that to me, touring in those days was an essential part of any production, and they all had to be designed to be taken on tour. So, and he said it was almost unimaginable to have a theatre company in Galway without a touring dimension. And it was about touring out into the countryside, but in other cases, as in Ashtori, the Spidale, that company, based in Spiddle, obviously, would come into Antwerp and perform plays there. And then the last thing I suppose to say, well, two more things to say. Firstly, there is a very idiotic view which suggests that the 1950s and the 1960s, are sort of, the 1960s didn't happen somehow in Ireland, and these were dark days. But in fact, in the early 60s and late 50s, you'd be far more likely to see, a French play or a new American play or a new English play, and many Irish plays as well, as you would be today. You'd be hard pressed today to find a contemporary French play being performed in Galway, but that wasn't the case, as I say, in the 60s and early 70s, and even in the late 1950s. And then I think the last thing to say is that theatre was incredibly popular. Theatre going was incredibly popular, and theatre activity, performance, and sort of being involved in whatever dimension of theatre. And I think it was because it was a demonstration of a kind of social fluency and civic competency. A whole range of basic competencies were demonstrated in getting involved in theatre, from the technical one of just clear enunciation when acting, self-possession, good bodily presence, to a usually unspoken sense of the possibilities and limits of socio-political intervention. So theatre was a very, very important part of a sort of middle class culture, and of also sort of demonstrating your ability to participate in society. Father Ward in 1962 said, "A drama group in a parish provides a liberal education in itself. Its advantages are social, cultural, and even spiritual to all concerned, producer, players, technicians, and audience." So a vibrant period, and a period that is often neglected, unfortunately, because 1975, of course, sees an explosion of new theatre with Druid. But unfortunately, that also means that the previous period, which was extremely interesting and very vibrant, isn't properly considered.
Yeah. Thank you, Lionel. And the French plays that you mentioned would have been in the Taibhdearc mainly through the medium of Irish, is that right? Yeah.
They would, and also in the university, at the grammar school hall, or wherever the university was performing. Also on Common Dramiachta as well in the university. All of these would have been doing either plays translated into Irish, or they would have been doing them in French as well in any of those locations. Yeah.
Thank you, Lionel. Interestingly, we've got a message in from Deirdre Nichanila, who tells us that her parents met in the Taibhdearc.
Ah, great. Lots of people did. I mean, the Taibhdearc brought together on Céad Cá, the regiment, Irish-speaking regiment in Renmore Barracks. And, I mean, this is also the place where Siobhan McKenna cut her teeth. And it was a wonderful meeting place, and Siobhan McKenna's father, who was professor of maths at UCG, as it was called then, and it would have been very, very protective of his daughter, felt, it was perfectly safe for her to participate in Antibes, and very good for her Irish, and it sort of brought out the best in people. So Antibes, very exciting place, and a lot of people did meet, in that theatre and in others. It was a great place to meet, and to meet romantically too. Gave people a bit of space.
Oh yeah, right. Yes, Deirdre corrects me now. It wasn't her parents. It was her grandparents who were contemporaries of Sean and Maura Stafford.
Yeah, they really should be mentioned. They were quite outstanding, and I think there's a period. I mean, one could debate this between 1969 and sort of maybe 1977, 78, when you would have to say that what was happening at Antibes was truly astounding. It was really brilliant. Remember, they had an experimental little theatre. The Antibes itself takes 200, but they had a very small theatre called Antibes, and there they did experimental plays. It did include one play actually by Dickie Byrne called Nano. A lot of these plays were, looking at issues to do with, miscreant sexuality, and they were as probing as in a way that perhaps we don't associate with this period. I mean, if one looks at this period and thinks of it as a time of prudery and reticence about sexuality and about intimacy and emotional issues, that's absolutely not the case. Not the case. The 1960s in Galway sees just this plethora of plays. Peter Weiss's Marasad, The Good Person of Szechuan by Brecht, Tennessee Williams' The Glass Menagerie, Harold Pinter's The Birthday Party, John Arden's Sergeant Musgrave's Dance. Amazing plays being done.
Thanks, Lionel.
Thank you.
So I'll just move over now, if I may, to Anna Falkenau. While all this activity was going on, Anna, in the theatres, what was the story with regard to traditional music?
Well, I'll open with a quote.
Yes.
From a little bit later, from the 70s, and it says, "It was exciting. I was young and I'd come from Carlow where I'd never heard traditional music. And here was this mighty scene in Galway. Chicks, reels, drink, song and sex. That's where the buzz and energy was in Galway in the mid to late 70s. Describes Galway Arts Festival founder Ollie Jennings, his formative years on the way to a career in arts and music promotion. But had Ollie Jennings arrived in Galway 10 years earlier, however, he would have come across a very different scene. In fact, a first nucleus of an Irish traditional music scene in Galway city only grew during the 1950s with the migration of musicians from surrounding rural areas for extra musical reasons to Galway. They came for work. The majority of these musical incomers hailed from East Galway, a region then famous for its traditional music through radio broadcasts and early recordings. Most well known of these is flute and fiddle player Eddie Maloney. The foundation of a Coltas Curator Ciaran branch in 1956 and the Loch Lurgan Cayley Band the same year facilitated a movement of Irish traditional music making into a new space, the pop. As a result, by 1960, occasional semi-private music sessions, non-commercial in nature, took place in two public houses, namely at the Eagle Bar, located at the corner of Henry Street on Sea Road and previously at Cullen's, now the Pucon on Foster Street. Notably, these two premises were owned by publicans who had also moved into Galway City into the previous decade and had a love for Irish traditional music. For the most, to quote Dick Byrne, who was just mentioned several times by Lionel and was very important in the music scene as well, it must be realized that singing and music in pubs was greatly frowned on back in those days. And if you sang in a pub, you stood a good chance of being thrown out. Singer, guitar player, author, and architect Dick Byrne writes this in his memoirs. But Dick Byrne, in fact, founded Galway's first ballad club starting in December 1961, which, quickly gaining in popularity, morphed into the Folk Castle Folk Club in 1963. It was located at the Enna Hotel in Dominic Street. not far from the Eagle Bar. This was the first weekly public music session in the Galway city pub, with a commercial element in that Dick Byrne received the princely sum of £3 a night. While its focus lay with folk and traditional songs of various types, Irish traditional fiddle player May Staunton of Staunton's shop in Spiddle and tin whistle player Festy Conlon used to attend these also. The Castle Folk Club, Galway's earliest, became widely known as an important venue nationally and internationally for folk and traditional music. It started singer and banjo player Sean Turrell on his music career. It also was the venue where seminal Irish folk revival band Sweeney's Men found together at a summer residency soon abandoned in 1966, subsequently hitting the road around Ireland in the Sweeney's van on Johnny Moynihan's suggestion. Let me return to the Eagle Bar mentioned earlier. By the mid-1960s, Irish traditional music sessions at the Eagle Bar became a weekly event, growing out of the earlier Comhaltas meetings and occasional sessions. Musicians received no payment. With international folk revival movements gaining momentum, these sessions now attracted newcomers from a variety of musical and social backgrounds. So musician and Irish music scholar Checky Small recalls one of these. It was just a small gathering. There used to be hardly anybody in the pub apart from the musicians themselves. The proprietor was Martin Ford, who had a garage in the town. The guiding hand musically in the session was Pádraig O'Cara, who played the tin whistle. He was a scientist and academic at UCG. The core group in the session included Eamon and Martin Rubbit, brothers who played fiddles. Dick Byrne used to sing and play the guitar. We were all mesmerized with Eddie Maloney's wonderful playing on the flute, the tin whistle, and the fiddle, of course. Other musicians would join in. Jimmy Cummins, an accordion player and businessman in the town, would be there occasionally. None of those people were full-time musicians or anything like that. Then there were people like myself, young people who had become attuned to traditional music after being initially enthused by the international folk music revival at the time. They had become interested in traditional music in exactly the same way as I did, because it was in the air. So yeah, it was very much a developing scene at the time. I don't know, John, are you there? I can't see my big picture.
Yes, okay.
Can I
we'll leave it there for the moment. Anna, thank you very much. That was very interesting. If I can, your reference to the Forecastle there leads us neatly into my next question to Lionel, which is which I think was associated with the early Druid as well. Is that so, Lionel?
Yeah, it is, absolutely. They perform in that space, which I think holds about 40 or 60, a very small space. And that kind of intimacy was a big part of the early Druid. I mean, a real sense of excitement and of the bodies of the actors being very close to the bodies of the audience. A real sense, too, of this being a young company. You know, Druid was founded in 1975, but it grew out of Dramsoc or Dramasoc, or the Hobbits as they were referred to by members in 1972. So 1972 sees Mary Mullen's first production. I think it's with Gary Hines, it's The Loves of Cas Maguire. And indeed, this is one of the first plays that inaugurate Druid when they have their season of summer plays in 1975. They do 3 plays: The Playboy of the Western World, Brian Friel's The Loves of Cas Maguire, and a play that you don't hear about much now called Kevin Laffin's play. It's a 2 foot 6 inches above the ground world. So in a way, these 3 plays tell you a great deal about the kind of attraction that Druid had and maintained for, you know, the next 15 years. Firstly, a vigorously physical and anti-romantic approach to sing, and more importantly, to rural Ireland and all aspects of it. And alongside that, the performance of a range of contemporary British, American and Irish plays, like Kevin Laffan's play would be an example, so would Brian Friel. And these sort of plays typically would champion ideas of individual autonomy as longing to be freed from the weight of a repressive tradition. So this is very kind of a normative notion of what art is supposed to be doing in the mid-1970s. And this is really what Druid begin with. The productions and the directorial style of Gary Hines, I mean, really does have to be credited. These were very tightly done, very disciplined, very, very physical. There was one production, and it may well have been in the Forecastle, where you came into the theatre. It was of the Playboy of the Western World. And the first thing that struck you was the smell of turf smoke. So there was turf smoke throughout the auditorium. And it was this kind of visceral kind of feeling that, Druid generated. I mean, I can't emphasize enough the degree to which it tuned in to you know, I mean, a very strong project of modernization, of Ireland being sort of having to shift in a way to make itself more accommodating, as it were, to international business. I mean, so this is the time of digital, of Thermo King coming to Galway, and really Druid is kind of saying, you know, if Ireland or rural Ireland or Ireland west of the Shannon had a reputation for being, I don't know, religious or caught in the past or, you know, whatever, it wasn't the case. In fact, it could be demonstrated that it was eager to adapt and eager to change. So this was all part of that energy that Druid traded on. Remember, they began as calling themselves Druid, the Repertory Company of Galway. Now that term was quietly and relatively quickly dropped. And by the mid-1980s, they were a highly successful production company, and they were known as Druid Performing Arts Limited. They were a limited company. So this is a money-making venture, but it's also an extremely, you know, an extremely exciting theatrical one. In addition.
Thanks. Thank you, Lionel.
Not at all.
I'll move over again to Anna. So you described a scene, a music scene in the 1960s. There was something of a quickening in the 1970s. I understand. Is that correct understanding?
That's right, John. So yeah, the scene, I suppose, changed then in the 70s, moving on from the 60s, building on that nucleus that had developed, and I suppose folk music revival movements. I don't know, I can't see. Can you see me on the screen?
Yes, I can. Yes.
Okay, because I can't see myself on.
Everybody can see you.
Okay, great. So yeah, from the late 1960s, really, Irish traditional music started to appear more frequently in public houses, both in commercial and non-commercial sessions. One of the first live music venues where musicians were remunerated for playing Irish traditional music was O'Reilly's on Foster Street from 1969. Now, interesting here is that its owner, Jim O'Reilly, realized the commercial value of presenting live traditional music just after UCG student Sean O'Connor went in and was looking for a quiet place for an Irish conversation night, a choral night inclusive of music and dance. And that proved so popular that that really Jim O'Reilly caught on to putting on live music then, and it became the first live music venue. So the Irish then went out the window with the popularity it gained. Musical performances then there became staged and amplified and eventually took place every night of the week. It was a successful commercial enterprise, and it was the first of its kind in Galway City. It was the overflow from O'Reilly's then that got Cullen's going. If you couldn't get into O'Reilly's, you went to Cullen's, recalls accordion player Jimmy Dillon. Throughout the 1970s, Cullen's became a vibrant place of music making, Ad hoc sessions took place any time and day of the week, and it was an atmosphere of celebration of music and culture, of socializing, transmission and sharing. Collins differed from O'Reilly's in that music making was spontaneous, non-staged and predominantly non-remunerated. Unlike the Eagle Bar earlier in the 60s, there was a sizable audience, with members often actively participating in the sessions, perhaps through dance, song and commentary. And Piper Eugene Lamb remembers it as a little haven of music. So then by the early 1970s, the music scene in Galway had developed into a pop gig scene that made it viable for musicians to live off their performance income, oftentimes supplemented by lucrative busking. Galway's growing reputation as a centre for traditional music brought with it the emergence of a migration flow for musical reasons, and fiddle player Mickey Finn is an example of this. He arrived in 1972 and his name became synonymous with the cellar bar located on Eglinton Street, which really was another hotspot for music and folks from various different art scenes. Brian Checony, an American art tourist who visited Galway in 1985, evokes in his memoirs the beauty and quality of transcendence that Mickey Finn's music held for listeners. The Cellar was a noted bar in town. We arrived just after dinner, but the place was already quite full. We found a spot against the wall, got pints and waited. About half an hour later, a hush suddenly fell over the room, and I turned to see that Mickey now had placed his fiddle under his chin. With no announcement, the room had gone suddenly silent as a concert hall. I don't know how long he played for, but it seemed like just a moment, so it must have been over an hour. I don't think I was ever so transported in listening to music as I was that night. Someone in the crowd later commented that this must be the music they listened to in heaven. So really there was an awful lot of music in the pubs throughout Galway at that stage. And I play an air. Mickey was very well known for his air playing in particular, and his repertoire included the Greenfields of Canada, Eamon and Knock and Slieve Naman. But he also liked to play an air that his father composed. The tune became later known as Mickey Finn's Air. And it was later then also recorded by Alec Finn, the late Alec Finn, and Sean Ryan, the tin whistle player. So I suppose I'll give it a go here.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Anna.
Lovely.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you very much for that. That was lovely.
Great.
Okay. Right. I'll move back now to I suppose from where all this Rabelaisian stuff was going on in the theatres and the pubs and so on. There was other developments of an artistic character in the 1960s. So over to Anne. I suppose the cathedral was opened in the mid-1960s, and it was had a considerable amount of artistic input there. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, the cathedral is really important in terms of the number of artists who were involved in creating very beautiful pieces for the building. Of course, it was very controversial. It was led by Bishop Michael J. Brown, who's maybe a little notorious. He had a great hold on things for 40 years, almost 40 years. He was Bishop of Galway. And he had decided that the site of the old Galway jail, which we looked at in Hardiman's illustrations, that would be an ideal site on Nuns Island for the new cathedral. He commissioned an architect, Robinson, and what's really impressive is the beauty and the skill of the artwork contained within this building. For instance, at the three entrances to the building, which is absolutely massive, and as you know, and built out of Galway limestone, Donal O'Murchu, he did the very dramatic stone carvings at the entrances, each of the entrances, and he would have been known for doing the statue of Liam Mellows in Eyre Square. So he was a great nationalist and a Catholic, so I suppose he would have fitted in with Bishop Brown. One of the things to realise is that although the cathedral's artwork was done in the 1960s, there's no abstract art, and I think this is a reflection of the bishop's conservative tastes rather than what artists were doing at the time. Other important work are beautiful stained glass by Patrick Pollen, particularly the lovely rose window up behind the organ, and painters George Campbell and Ginny Deeney, they worked on the stained glass, and also Imogen Stewart, a very notable sculptor who's still alive. She did a magnificent 7-foot tall statue of the Virgin and Child. And there's frescoes and mosaics, and I mean, very much the artwork was done by artists at the top of their game. But as you say, very, very different what was happening on the ground in terms of music and fun and frolics, as Lionel said, I think earlier. Very different kind of art, but very beautiful and very high quality material.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks, Anna, for that. So I might just go over to Jerry now to look at the literary developments and the transformed Galway that Lionel and Anna and Anne have been talking about from the 60s, 70s forward. How has that Galway been represented by writers?
Yes, the music, the drama, all of that. The city that emerges from the pages of the writers, again, is a city of contradictions. It's a fun town, a party town, but it's a town of the tribes, and of course the tribes were commercial, economic based. The town that emerges from the novels and the stories, it's an ancient town, but yet very contemporary. It's Irish and Gaelic, but very cosmopolitan. The arts encouraged, but the driver is hard economics and bohemian, but very class conscious, as I mentioned before. If you take Kevin Barry's story, Party at Helen's, the student party town emerges there, and Julian Gough's Juno and Juliet, and his Jude Level 1. Perhaps a tad hyperbolic, but he calls the place the Sodom of the West. And Mike McCormick, Crow's Requiem, again, NUIG, or UCG as it was called back in those days, is very important, as Lionel has said there, the Druid emerging. But even if you go back to Brendan O'Hare's Líg Gahu, body student life being represented, well, we find that coming all the time. It's a reason for characters to find themselves turning up in Eyre Square somewhat bewildered, as in Mike McCormick's Crow's Requiem. Crow arrives here bewildered by the place and he finds love. And indeed, in Mike's Solar Bones, Marcus Conway finds himself overwhelmed by a town where the bizarre can find an outlet and be celebrated. But reality is never far away either from these pages, because in Mike's Solar Bones, the town fathers struggle with the outbreak of cryptosporidium, and again, reality biting in. And we have, of course, Fred Johnson's great poem, The Curse, where he says, for a week hard men in pubs drank to his memory who'd step over him in the street. So the party town, but there is the underbelly as well, again, which Ken Broon brings out very, very clearly in his darker works. And of course, we have Rita Ann Higgins and her uncompromising poems on issues of class and deprivation, such as Ode to Round Flats, and it's all because we're working class. The line, if we lived up in Taylor's Hill, do you think for 1 minute they'd put them big, dark, thick spy glasses on your child? Yes, and in her more recent Our Killer City, she asks about Galway, is it a capital of culture or a place for hippies with hobbies? So, as I say, a city of contradiction emerges from the pages that of literature. Of course, I go into it in a lot more detail in the article in the forthcoming publication that this talk is based on.
Thanks, thank you, Jerry. Thanks. I want to go back to Lionel now, and I see our clock is ticking away, but we still have some time to go back to Lionel and Anna. Yes, so I go to Anna first, in fact, to think about, would you say that Galway was a centre of innovation? Obviously it was, but in what way was Galway innovative in with regard to traditional music in the period since the one that you talked about?
Yes, John. So I suppose, you know, that vibrant session scene that developed during the 1970s, coming out of the 60s, and that I outlined earlier, and that enabled transmission, revitalization, and ultimately the popularization of Irish traditional music on a local level, also provided a creative space, and it facilitated musical innovation, probably most apparent and obvious in the formation of seminal Irish band the Danann. So just to point that out a little bit more, it had been a migration flow for extra musical reasons, namely work on the film production Alfred the Great that brought Alec Finn to Galway in 1968, and from here on to Spiddle. But musical reasons led accordion and banjo player Charlie Pickett to take up a postdoc position at UCG's biochemistry department in 1973. The biochemistry department actually was very important, but I won't go into that now. So via sessions in the cellar and the now legendary Sunday morning sessions in Uses and Spiddle, Alec Finn, Charlie Pickett and Johnny Ringo McDonough and Frankie Gaffin connected and would eventually form the Danann. So Frankie Gaffin explains in an interview with Tona Quinn, every Sunday morning there would also be a session, and I remember there was an air of anticipation when myself, Charlie, Alec, Ringo started playing the odd couple of tunes together. There was something in the air. You could feel the excitement, the enthusiasm coming from people once the four of us played together. So while the emergence of the Danann cannot be attributed only to the cellar and to Uses sessions, clearly these were essential for the formation of a seminal Irish traditional music band, which the Danann became, because I suppose they were groundbreaking and exciting for their new sound resulting from the innovative and intricate combination of fiddle and bouzouki, executed of course with superb musicianship. So that vibrant session scene really facilitated quite a few happenings. And it was Irish tradition as well, and the Danann, both the musical paths are closely linked to Ollie Jennings setting out on his music and arts promotion career. So the very first concert that Ollie Jennings promoted at the Aula Maxima at UCG in early 1974 featured Curator Line and Curator UCG. So Curator UCG actually was the Danann lineup, just not named yet. Ollie Jennings' second gig at Leisureland in the spring of 1974 featured the Chieftains. So all this really pointing to the importance that traditional music held at that stage in Galway and indeed in the national context. 4 years later then, we can see the multidisciplinary programme of the first Galway Arts Festival in 1978, featuring the Danann as headliner, as well as accordionist Martin O'Connor. So I suppose just in a general climate of creativity and growth throughout the 70s, and of course Lionel has pointed out Druid as well, but Irish traditional music making and that scene that had developed around the town was also very much at the root of further arts development in Galway City.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks. We'll be back to you before the end. Mm-hmm. If I go over quickly to Lionel now, just to think about the innovation in theatre in Galway and the challenges, I suppose, that have been presented themselves since the 1970s.
Yeah, well, just briefly, just to talk about the 1990s. I mean, there were two companies that were extraordinary, absolutely brilliant. One was called McDonough, the Wanderers. They only lasted 6 years, from 1987 to 1993. But in that space of time, just in terms of the kind of theatrical vernacular that they used, in terms of their ambition for the Irish language and also for the language of theatre, it was quite extraordinary. Two amazing productions, one a co-production with Riot a theatre company, an Irish language theatre company in Dublin called Woollyvarton, and the other one an Irish translation of Yerma, Lorca's Yerma. And they employed puppets. They did an amazing kind of Marcel Marceau kind of mime tradition of acting. And then there was Punchbag. Punchbag, I think, started in 1989. I have to, my notes are around me, and they also lasted not for a very long time, but in the time that they were active, and they started in the King's Head, and they used the Castle Motorworks. If you remember it, in the mid-1990s, that's down by Spanish Arch. They were adept at using sort of different venues. They had no actual theatre. Neither did Nafonagh. They did a lot of touring. The problems that they met were twofold. I mean, mostly it was funding. I mean, the Nafonagh found it very difficult to get funding. There was limited state funding available, and businesses who are supposed to sort of uphold all this creativity were not interested in theatre in Irish, even though Nafonagh's work had a huge international dimension, but nevertheless it was in the Irish language. So they folded for lack of funding. And a somewhat similar story is the story for Punchbag. David Quinn, who started Punchbag, gave me this quotation when I interviewed him. He said, "Once the economy changed, we finished." So basically, you know, there was this massive transformation, as we all know, of Galway when Galway was designated a tax-free area, or large sections of it were. But there was a recession in the beginning of the 1990s, and because of the recession, it was possible to rent cheap spaces to rehearse and to base your theatre in. Once the so-called Celtic Tiger took over, that became impossible. So now if you're a theatre company, so now you can say that Galway has gone from a situation where it had very few actually well-appointed theatres, apart from Montaviot. Now it has 4. It has Taviot na Galway, Druid Lane Theatre, Town Hall Theatre, and the Black Box. And of course it also has the University Theatre. But what it does not have now is any permanent all year-round residential theatre company, either amateur or professional. And if you were a new theatre company trying to start up in Galway, you would find it very difficult simply because of the cost of just not being able to get a space or rent a space. So it's a big consideration.
Thank you, Lionel. That takes us right up to the present, having started in 1820. So that was 200 years of artistic endeavour in Galway, and also representations of Galway. Our four panellists, as I said at the outset, are all contributors to this book, Hardiman and Beyond, Galway Arts and Culture, 1820 to 2020. And we've just had a flavour, I suppose, of the contributions of these learned contributors. We'll basically leave the discussion there. I'd like to thank all of the contributors, thank the audience for staying with us. And I think to finish, Anna Falkenau has agreed to play us a tune, to play us out, essentially. We may have another one of these sessions or more. We'll see what the demand is, but people will be able to find out in the usual ways. So over then, in conclusion, to Anna to finish up. Yeah.
Thank you, John. So
just one thing, Anna. I think you may need to stay very still because when you're playing, because the sound varied the last time. Sorry about that.
Vary. Okay, sorry about that.
Yeah. Thanks.
Too engaged in it.
Please.
So
Thanks, Anna. Right.
yeah. So thanks so much. So I will play us out with a jig called the Climber Jig, which can be heard on a fantastic BBC programme's great footage from 1961 from T-Net Vigilance in Spittal. And of course, the connections, I didn't go much into that, but the connections with the rural surroundings, in particular Spittal, play a huge importance in the development of music, Irish traditional music in Galway. So you can access that program on YouTube. Ronan Brown has put it up there, and it's fantastic to watch it. So there's three musicians that I mentioned as part of the early nucleus of musicians in Galway in those 60s, getting us started, I suppose. These were Mace Staunton, Jimmy Cummins, and Eddie Maloney, all mentioned early on. But that Climber Jig was actually a newly composed tune by fiddle player and composer Sean Ryan from Tipperary. And just to pinpoint at the point really, and not to that creativity and innovation really are ongoing principles in Irish traditional music. And I suppose it's something that came through in our discussion as well on various aspects. So thanks again. Here's the Climber.